what we mean when we say Baroque music is we've borrowed the terms from art, from the visual arts. It means stuff that's very ornate, very elaborate, full of curlicues and in visual architectural terms, lots of fancy columns, lots of gold filigree. But it doesn't mean that this music is cold and sterile, because this music was written by real people, and it was designed to entertain them, to move them to laughter or to tears. Just because they wore fancy wigs and fancy clothes didn't mean that they were somehow made of straw. They still had beating hearts, and they still liked to laugh and cry just as we do. And this is the music that moved them in that way.
People back then weren't that different than we are today. I mean, we have the same feelings that they had back then. And this music moves people, and it's still moving people.
Music then, as now, was a part of everybody's life. It had to be performed by live musicians. You couldn't switch on a Baroque tape machine or a Baroque CD player. There was music to dance to. Everybody could dance in those days. So everybody knew the dances, and composers, the best composers, wrote dance music. Mozart was the court dance composer to the Emperor of Austria. That was his job. He had to write music for the emperor to dance to.
Minuet is a dance, and if you were a teenager in the 18th century and you wanted to get to know people in the world who would help you move up in life, or you wanted to make contacts at court, you needed to know how to dance. And they felt that a dancer that was very nimble on their feet also had a quick mind. So that's why dance was very important. This is a diagram of a dance. It shows just one little phrase, and this is a bourrée d'Achille. It shows all these different patterns of movement. It shows all the detail of the arms and the legs. So if you're a musician and you play a minuet, which is a kind of dance, it's very helpful to know that it goes and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then it can travel. And that sometimes in history it was very fast, and sometimes it was slow and stately.
Music is to some extent a universal language. There are people living all over the world to whom, if you played a very sad piece of music, will respond by feeling sad. If you play something with a very driving rhythm, they might start tapping their feet. But you couldn't talk to them because you don't speak the same language. Therefore, music taps into the deepest emotions that human beings have.
It's a way to sort of understand people better, people in different places, different cultures, different times, but maybe different places in the world. And the more you can listen, you just get a taste of things that are incredible, that are just outside of our usual little sphere that we walk around in.
Baroque, classical, and romantic are terms, first of all, that were never used at the time. They just thought of it all as modern, because at one time, all this music was modern. Somebody had just written it, and indeed they only really liked playing modern music. They thought that old music was dreadful. It's only really in the last 50, 60 years that we've started to play old music.
Instead of playing this year's hits or music from not very long ago, you're playing music from a long time ago that was composed and performed and then forgotten. You sort of feel like you're a time-traveling explorer sometimes. And in Philharmonia, we've had occasion to play all kinds of things that hadn't been heard in hundreds of years.
It's easy to limit ourselves, but I think that people's natural state is really one of expansion. And if you don't cut yourself off and say, oh, I don't think I like that, and just listen to everything, you're just going to be more. Yourself will be a bigger self.
Period music is generally come to mean now music from the 16th century on being played on the instruments for which it was written, rather than the instruments necessarily of the modern symphony orchestra, all of which have been altered, changed, and modernized to suit the needs of today.
People who played this music were very much like we are. They had certain tools that they used and certain sounds they were trying to create. And that if we use the same materials that they use, if we make the reeds the way they did and we approach the music the way they did, that we'll understand the music more. We'll hear something that they heard. We'll hear it the way they meant it to be. And there's something really wonderful about that. I mean, there's something timeless about that as we try to understand something from another age in our own way, with our own ears.
Particularly from the 17th, 18th century on, about the time that America was being colonized and then became a country, the music became very splendid indeed and was played on glorious instruments like the one at which I'm sitting now, this golden harpsichord. And this music, by European composers, Handel, Bach, Vivaldi, a little later, Mozart, Haydn, and Beethoven, was written for instruments that are slightly different from the ones we have today. Mostly all made of wood, some instruments now are metal, a lot softer, a lot sweeter, and designed for smaller spaces. Mozart's piano was about half the size of the piano that you hear it on now. Therefore, the whole dynamic of the piece is different. So you're listening to it totally differently. We can't say, we're not arrogant to say it now, to say, this is how Mozart did it. But we can tell the proportions of how it must have sounded. Because Mozart never played the same piece twice. He improvised all over it. So if he did it one day and he played it the next day, it would be different. So nothing's fixed in stone that way. But you can say Mozart's piano sounded like this, approximately like this, and it was this soft, and therefore everybody around it had to play that softly in order for it to be heard.
It finally occurred to people when they were doing some research, mostly in the 60s, the 1960s, that instruments in the Baroque era were different from the way they are made now. Violins were a little different, and the wind instruments were a lot different. If you compare an orchestra, let's say we had an orchestra with a singer, and the singer was the soloist, and they were singing something. That'd be sort of like if you hear some rock music and you hear the singer singing something, and then there's a guitar lick. That's kind of a lot the way a Baroque orchestra, or violins in a Baroque orchestra, would support a singer. In Handel arias, for example, the singer sings their thing and then the violins imitate or comment on it in some way, a lot like a guitar would do a riff in between lines of a pop song.
When you play in the section of an orchestra, one thing that you notice right away with the instruments of the time of Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven is that each instrument actually has a unique voice, a unique sound, I think to a larger extent than modern instruments, which tend to sound a little bit more the same. And this couldn't possibly happen with period instruments. They each have really unique and independent voice. And the flute sounds just more woody, a slight little bit more air than the modern instrument, for example. But given that it's the clarinet, I think the clarinet just has a slightly warmer sound than the modern one, and certainly a sound that's quite different from the other instruments.
When you see the one that sticks up and has the bell sticking up, that's the bassoon. The one that's like a periscope going up out of the woodwind section. I like that it lets me play lower than I can sing. I can't sing very low, but I can play very low on the bassoon, and I get to kind of be the fundament of the ensemble, the base of the ensemble, everything that the ensemble sits on. That's my role. I'm the foundation. So I always think that the bassoon sound is a very human sound. And when we're working with singers, and you might have a singer who's saying, "Oh no," then the bassoon will do something like, and it's the same thing. It's the instrument saying, "Oh no,"
Fifth grade and middle school, I played this modern flute, and I always wondered, why did they say it was part of the woodwind family of instruments? I mean, I could see that the oboe was made out of wood, and the clarinet was made out of wood, the bassoon was made out of wood, and then here I had this metal flute. And I wondered, what was up with that? And it wasn't till obviously later when I found out, gee, the early flutes were made out of wood, and I got to play them, that I was totally in love with the way they sounded and the way it felt to play them, and it made so much sense. This is where they came from. And the early wood flutes blend so well with their other counterparts that are also made out of wood. I think it's so cool to play these wooden instruments. The sound is really warm, and they can do things that the modern flute can't do. You can do really cool, crazy sounding trills, and some of them sound sort of bird-like.
And this is my cello. It's a 5-string cello, which is rather unusual from the 17th century. On a Baroque cello, there is no end pin. And the end pin was an adaptation on the modern cello to help you hold it up. So it's a prop on the floor. Another difference is, of course, the type of string we use, which is made of sheep's intestines, sheep's gut, as opposed to steel. Then in this cello, as opposed to a modern instrument, a modern cello, there are only 4 strings. This one has 5. It has the normal 4 strings as a cello, a modern cello, which is the C, the G, the D, the A. In addition, there's a high E string. So this is a very rare instrument to see from the period. The Baroque instruments have maybe a quieter sound, but they have a larger dynamic range. On a modern instrument, your bass dynamic is pretty high already. They cannot play as softly as we can play. Within one note, we can play from a very soft point to a very loud point and come back very quickly. So that sort of ability to swell on a note is unique to these Baroque instruments.
This horn is in E flat. It's probably about 18 feet long if you stretch it all the way out. The selection of notes that it plays just by itself is very limited. So you can see that there's a lot of notes missing that there would be on a violin or a piano or in the voice. The method that was developed to play the notes in between is to insert the hand in the bell. This is really where the hand horn gets its name. And what we do is we actually close our hand by degrees inside the bell, open and close. And by using this method, we can actually get more notes between the open notes. So for every open note, we can close each one. So now we've effectively doubled the number of notes that we can play on this very simple instrument. The role of the drums is most often associated with the trumpets. We're the loud guys, the trumpets and the drums. This is a jingling Johnny. That's the English word for this instrument. It's originally from Turkey. All you do is shake it.
we're accentuating or punctuating what's really important in the measure. Sometimes I play very little, but I feel that we're indispensable because there come those big moments in a piece where you really need the heavy stuff.
So this is the Baroque oboe. It's a very simple type of instrument. So you can see it has very few keys, just the holes. I have a couple of keys here. This one to reach the hole that I can't quite reach with my finger. And this one actually opens a hole so that I don't have to keep my finger there the entire time, which one could do. But and it's, as I said, it's a very simple instrument. It's sort of like a chair leg with holes. And but the simplicity of the design has nothing to do with how complex the things you can do with it are. It's sort of like a paintbrush or a pencil in that regard. We could spend a lot of time talking about the features of the oboe, but this makes no noise at all. In order to make the noise, I need to put in a reed. This is the actual interesting bit of it. To get it to play, I have to make something that makes a sound like that, and it sounds horrible by itself. It's really amazing that you can actually make music with it. But we put it in the oboe, we can actually do something.
Nearly every instrument we're talking about here was developed before microphones and electronic technology changed the whole picture. Because now you could take a period instrument orchestra and put it in a 3,000-seater hall, or you could put it in Candlestick Park and put microphones on it. If we wanted to use them, we don't, in fact, but we don't use that, except, of course, to make CDs and to get on people's iPods. That's all the other side, the technical side of the business, and we're just as state-of-the-art as any other music organization. We use every bit of technology that's available to us, but we don't stick microphones in these instruments so that they can be heard by an audience. We just have a smaller audience. Now, the rehearsals are where it all happens. The performance is great, we enjoy those, but if we didn't rehearse, we couldn't give a performance. Now, can we just please absolutely confirm something? And that is that number 24 is the same speed as number 23. I want to, David needs to listen to it, but it's going to be sort of, oh, it's slower, isn't it? I know some people have a page turn, which is confusing, but it's the same speed. So we had a few friskies last night. Can we do number 23? Of course, will you stand? This is also so David can get a balance and see what happens. So this is the pickup to actually bar 44. Let all. So 1, 2. This is where you try out ideas, and you don't impose ideas, at least that's the theory. You don't say, it will be like this, because the musicians have ideas too, and one of the things that's great, and this music is flexible enough to be able to do it, is to have a give and take with the musicians.
We get our music in the mail about 3 weeks before we start, and I take a look at that, try and identify the really difficult bits, put in bowings and fingerings that I need. And I try to really learn my part cold before I go in there, because I want to be able to be as spontaneous as I can when we start rehearsing. I know it will change. Whatever I have in my head is not what's going to be the final result.
In a rehearsal, an orchestra spends most of their time doing short bits of music. We don't play long sections, but maybe one 3-minute movement or a piece of a work of music. And we'll play through it, and we'll see what went wrong, what went right, and we'll talk about it.
Bar 5, the first 2 notes can be shorter in here. And similarly, 9. Instead of... Oh, what was that? Make the D a little shorter, can you?
Should we be loud here, soft there? The strings will decide what the bowing should be. The violins, in conjunction with the winds, will decide where the ornaments or the trills should be placed. And the bass line will decide, what the articulations should be. What that means, whether the notes are short or long. So all this stuff gets worked out in a rehearsal.
It's all of these individuals coming together with a common purpose to do something together with a really dynamic leader.
Bar 16 on... Can you bring that out a lot? It's too juicy. It's such a lovely chord. Let's give us a bit more middle to that, will you? Let's do 14. Just for the second time. 14. So 3, 4.
The group is so much more than each of us individually could be. So there's a coming together as a group, but also a real freedom in the way we play together, because we've played together for so long that we can really do very dynamic things. It's a lot of fun.
Yeah. It's frisky, but it mustn't be frisky and a cellorando. It's a long piece.
Playing Baroque music, we get a certain amount of freedom that one usually doesn't in a symphony orchestra, especially if you have anything important to play, if you're playing the solo. You're expected to elaborate and improvise a little bit.
Some hold instruments. Let all mankind of pleasure share and blessings.
It's me who hasn't worked this out, but yum diddle 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 ding. So let's make it a half note at the end rather than a quarter note, which is what the trumpets played.
It's not like playing in a symphony orchestra where if I start playing stuff that's not on the page, I'm probably going to get some dirty looks, at the very least. Here it's actually quite the opposite very often. If you play what's on the page, it's wrong. You have to do something else, anything. Really, just make it interesting.
Yeah. Dum diddle 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 dum and bum bum. We don't need to do that again. It's safer. Good. This is all fine. We have to know, in as far as we can, as much information as we can about the composer, the music, and how it might have been performed. And then we use that knowledge, not slavishly, but then to create a performance to put across what we think the composer's ideas might be.
Nick, for one thing, he is so animated and he has such wild things to say about the music as we're working it out. The details of a phrase, and he can be really funny and really deep. And one of the fun things is just to hear what he has to say about it and then to try to put that into sound. And also to do that with everybody else at the same time. I mean, it's sort of like flying with a flock of birds or something.
Imagine that it's a shivery day, will you? It of course isn't, but probably was in Purcell's time. The Thames used to freeze. So, this first note, can we get the first note to rather than... In the 18th century, there wasn't a conductor, because usually what happened is the composer had written the piece the week before, and he was there, and it was the composer who said, I want it to go like this, I want it to be... Nobody had to second guess the composer because he'd written it. My job is to somehow second guess what the composer might have intended. But in the 18th century, he was there. He was a living, breathing musician, and so he would write the piece, often very close to performance time. Copyists would frantically write it out, no Xerox in those days. And musicians would rehearse it a couple of times. Composer would say what he wanted. He'd often find that maybe he had a better idea having heard it. And they would perform it. And then quite often after that, it was forgotten. It was sent to the library and he had to write something new. So just slightly swing all the 8th notes that you have. Should we try that? From bar 41 of number 31. So, 1, 2, great. That's about the only time they occur, but just swing the 8th notes. You'll hear them do it for hours beforehand. I think that's all we have time for right now, so it's time for to turn from ugly ducklings into swans.
You can hear an audience, you can feel an audience. They're like a very large animal out there, usually a very benign, friendly animal that occasionally it sneezes and coughs and drops things. But sometimes it becomes incredibly still, and then there's this kind of aura that comes over the whole room that embraces everybody. The audience and all the performers are sharing something completely. And that's the very special kind of time. And a good concert has, hopefully, a few moments like that.